The thing about fractures is that they often start quietly. Not with a crack, but with pressure, with weight, with time, and by the time you notice the damage, it's already deep enough to split the entire foundation. Claire and Evan had been married for nearly 7 years. Not a perfect marriage, but not a bad one either, at least not in the way people define it from the outside. They had a house, respectable jobs, 2 cats, and a shared Amazon Prime account. They attended barbecues, they remembered birthdays, they still said, "Love you," before bed. But something underneath all of it had started to give way. And it didn't make a sound. The arguments had become routine. Not explosive, but cyclical. Small complaints about missed calls or unpaid bills would spiral into something colder, accusations buried under sarcasm. Silence that lasted just long enough to leave a bruise. Evan would come home late, citing another deadline, another emergency. Claire would ask, flatly, if it was going to be like this every night. He'd say, "You know how work is." She'd nod, but inside, the nod meant something else entirely. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't careless, he just wasn't present, at least not in the way that mattered. He still brought her coffee in the mornings, still kissed her cheek before walking out the door, but he no longer asked how she slept. He didn't notice when she stopped using sugar. He didn't ask why she no longer wore perfume to bed. Claire noticed. She noticed everything. The way his hand no longer lingered on her back when passing behind her. The way he replied with a distracted, "Aha," when she told him something vulnerable. The way his eyes never left the TV when she cried during a movie. It wasn't that he didn't love her. She believed he did. But love that is not expressed eventually feels like absence. And absence, especially when it wears the mask of routine, is the loneliest kind of abandonment. They argued most about time. Who had it? Who wasted it? Who never gave enough of it? She asked for small things, an afternoon together without phones, a dinner that wasn't takeout in front of a screen. He promised, then forgot, then promised again. She didn't want much, just to be seen, not as a to-do list, not as a roommate, as a woman. There was a night, not long before everything cracked open, when she stood in front of the mirror in the bathroom, wearing a dress she hadn't worn in years. Red, soft against her skin, made her feel something she'd forgotten, desirable. She stepped into the living room, his favorite wine already breathing in a glass. He looked up from his laptop, smiled politely, and said, "You look nice. Is someone coming over?" She laughed, because that's what you do when you don't know what else to say. Then she sat down across from him, crossed her legs, and sipped the wine, not because she enjoyed it, but because it was something to hold. A distraction. He didn't hit me, he didn't leave, he just stopped showing up emotionally. She said that once to her sister over the phone. Her sister told her to fight for it. That marriage goes through seasons. That maybe he was just tired. But Claire had been fighting quietly for years. And the exhaustion had become bone deep. It wasn't always this way. There were times when Evan would trace circles on her arm while they lay in bed. When they would cook together barefoot in the kitchen, stealing kisses between stirring pots. When they would text each other from across the room. Silly things, just to laugh. But life had replaced laughter with logistics. And somewhere in between paying bills and scheduling oil changes, they forgot how to choose each other. Claire started having long conversations, with herself, with the ceiling fan, with the woman in the mirror. She would sit in the bathtub with her knees to her chest, wondering what it meant to stay when your heart was already halfway out the door. She didn't want to cheat. She didn't want to leave. She wanted a sign, a reason to keep hoping. But hope started to sound like delusion. Then one night, during a rainstorm, her phone buzzed. A name she hadn't seen in years. A former colleague, someone who once made her laugh when the office felt like a cage. The message was simple. "Hey. Just thought of you, hope you're okay." She stared at it for a long time, not because she wanted to reply, but because for the first time in a long while, someone had asked if she was okay. And that question landed like a crack in the glass. Not loud, but irreversible. The message arrived on a Thursday evening, just after dinner, just after another argument that neither of them had the energy to finish. Claire was in the bedroom folding laundry in silence while Evan scrolled through emails downstairs, pretending to be buried in deadlines. She heard the chime, a soft buzz against the nightstand wood, and instinctively reached for her phone. It was a name she hadn't seen in 3 years. Julian. He had been a colleague once. Back when Claire worked in a different department. A different building. Almost a different life. They'd never crossed any lines. But the tension had always been there. Muted. Professional, but undeniable. He had made her laugh when days felt heavy. He had noticed small things. When she changed her hairstyle. When she stopped wearing her wedding ring for a week during a skin allergy. Evan hadn't even asked. The message was short. Hey. Just thought of you. Hope you're okay. Claire stared at the screen longer than necessary. She didn't type anything back. Not then, but her thumb hovered, trembling in the silence of a house that had long stopped feeling like home. Over the next few days, they messaged occasionally, innocent things. At first, updates about work, life, mutual acquaintances. He told her he'd left the company and was doing freelance marketing now. She told him she was still teaching, still living in the same neighborhood. He didn't ask about Evan. She didn't bring him up. But Julian knew. He remembered the way her voice would tighten when she spoke about home. He remembered the tired smiles, the offhand comments she used to make in the break room. If I didn't have to make dinner for someone who won't even notice, I'd stay late too. One night, she asked him why he messaged her out of nowhere. His reply came quickly. I always wondered how you were doing. And lately, I don't know, something told me to check in. I guess I was hoping someone had. That line, I guess I was hoping someone had, hit her in a place she thought had gone numb. Claire didn't think of it as emotional cheating. She told herself it was just conversation, just connection, something human in a life that had become mechanical. But deep down, she knew it meant something, because she started checking her phone more often. Started thinking about what she'd say to him next. Started remembering what it felt like to be seen. Julian was good with words. Not poetic, just attentive. He asked about her teaching. Remembered the names of students she'd once told him stories about. He said things like, "You always had a way of calming the chaos around you." Evan had never said anything like that. Not recently, not ever. Maybe one night, after a particularly brutal fight with Evan about money, about how she was too sensitive, and made things more dramatic than they were, Claire went to bed early. She lay there in the dark, back turned to the man she had once promised forever to, and unlocked her phone. Julian had sent another message. I know this might sound strange, but if you ever just want to get a drink and talk in person, no pressure. I'd like to see you again. Just as friends. Just to listen. She read it 3 times. She didn't answer, but she didn't delete it either. The next morning, she caught herself choosing a nicer top before heading to work. Applying mascara she hadn't touched in weeks. It wasn't for Julian, not really, but it wasn't for Evan either. 2 days later, she typed back, "Maybe, I'm not sure, but thank you for the offer." His reply was simple. "Anytime. I'll be around." And then, after another silence, one that stretched for almost a week, she messaged again, "Is that offer still open?" His response came within seconds, "Of course. Hotel Melrose, Thursday night, 8 p.m. The bar there is quiet. No pressure." Claire stared at the message. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. That Thursday, Evan left early for a work dinner. He didn't ask where she was going. Didn't notice the heels she hadn't worn in months. At 7:47 p.m., Claire stood outside Hotel Melrose, her heart pounding beneath her coat. She hadn't stepped inside yet. She hadn't crossed any line. Not yet. But she had the message open on her phone. And in that moment, she realized, temptation doesn't begin at the door. It begins the moment you feel seen by someone who isn't supposed to be looking. And it grows in silence. Exactly where love used to live. She arrived 5 minutes early. The taxi pulled to the curb in front of Hotel Melrose. And for a moment Claire stayed seated, hands clasped in her lap. watching the reflection of herself in the car window. It was still raining, lightly, enough to blur the neon edges of the city, to make everything feel softer than it really was. She paid the driver, stepped out, and stood under the awning. Room 704. That was the number he had texted her. Inside the lobby, everything was hushed in velvet and downlights. The kind of place designed to look expensive without announcing it. Claire walked slowly, past the front desk, past the elevator, into the corridor lined with patterned carpet. Her heels sank slightly into the plush with every step. Her phone vibrated. A text from Julian. "I'm here. No rush." She didn't reply. At the door to 704, she stopped. Her heart wasn't racing from anticipation. It was guilt, sharp, coiled, alive in her chest. She raised her hand, not to knock, but to steady herself against the wall. Her wedding ring felt heavier than usual. A metallic chill clung to her finger. This wasn't about Julian, it never really had been. This was about feeling wanted, and seen, and remembered as something more than a shadow in her own home. But now, standing here, all the imagined outcomes collapsed into one sudden truth. She couldn't do it. She knocked anyway. Julian opened the door, wearing a soft black sweater and jeans. No smirk, no invitation in his posture. Just openness, and something almost like kindness. She didn't enter. Instead, she looked at him, really looked, and then down at her hand. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't." Before he could speak, she reached for her ring, slid it off, held it for a moment between her fingers, feeling the indent it had left on her skin. "I thought I needed to forget what I was holding on to," she said, "but maybe I just needed to remember why I put it on in the first place." She extended her palm and dropped the ring into his hand. Julian looked at it, stunned. "Claire," she shook her head, "I'm not giving it to you. I'm letting it go, because I almost crossed a line tonight I wouldn't be able to come back from. And I need to know that I chose not to, that I walked away." He nodded slowly. No bitterness, no chase. "That's okay," he said, gently. She smiled, weakly. "Take care of yourself." Then she turned and walked away. The hallway seemed longer this time. The elevator slower, the ride down quieter than it had ever been. Her eyes welled but didn't spill. Back on the street, she stood beneath the hotel's awning, letting the cold night air wash over her face. She didn't call a cab immediately. She just breathed. She hadn't cheated, but she hadn't saved her marriage either. As she walked away from the building, her reflection followed her in the puddles, blurred, unfamiliar, but there was something steady in her stride now. Not triumphant, not proud, just honest. Because sometimes, the hardest thing isn't saying no to someone else. It's saying yes to the version of yourself you still want to be. And walking away from what's easy, even when no one would have known you didn't. Julian stood in the hallway for a moment after Claire walked away. Her perfume still faint in the air. The weight of her wedding ring sitting in the center of his palm. The door to room 704 stood slightly ajar, and he didn't close it right away. He just stood there, staring at the ring, gleaming, round, heavy with meaning that didn't belong to him. He wasn't disappointed, not really, not surprised either. If anything, her refusal had been expected, maybe even calculated into his evening. He stepped back into the room and shut the door behind him. The lights were already dimmed, the curtains drawn. The air held that quiet hotel stillness, impersonal, climate-controlled, deliberately forgettable. Julian walked over to the desk and opened the top drawer. He placed the ring inside, carefully, almost ceremonially, as though it were an artifact. Behind him, the bathroom door opened. A woman emerged, hair damp, makeup refreshed, wearing a satin slip that caught the light in a way meant to be noticed. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "Well?" she asked, one eyebrow raised. Julian turned slowly. She didn't go through with it. The woman smiled, a sharp, knowing smile. She walked toward the bed and sat down, crossing her legs with ease. "But you did." Julian shrugged out of his sweater. "I didn't need her to." There was no malice in his voice. No triumph either. Just a flatness, like someone stating the weather. The woman tilted her head, studying him. Was that always the plan? She asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the minibar, poured a small measure of whiskey into a glass, and drank it without flinching. She gave you the ring? The woman asked. He nodded, said she couldn't cross the line, wanted to remember why she wore it. The woman chuckled softly. That's rich. Julian walked to the window and looked out at the rain. The city shimmered with indifference. Horns blared in the distance. Life moving on without permission. You know, he said after a long silence. Some people need an excuse to do the wrong thing. Others just wait for the chance. The woman stretched out on the bed, her head on the pillow now. Which are you? He didn't turn around. I stopped asking myself that a long time ago. She reached for the remote and turned on the TV. Some muted drama flickered across the screen. Julian stayed at the window. His reflection ghosted over the glass. What Claire didn't know, and what he had never intended to tell her, was that the message he'd sent wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't fate or intuition or some late-night longing. It was a test, a carefully timed message to a woman he once desired. Now just curious about. He had wanted to see how far she would go, how far she still could be pushed, and whether he still had the power to make her question everything. When she handed him the ring, it hadn't broken his heart. It had confirmed something darker, that he had never really respected what the ring meant. He didn't want to possess her. He just wanted to see if he could. The woman on the bed yawned. Are you coming to bed? Or are you going to stand there like a tortured poet all night? Julian turned finally, offering a thin smile. In a minute. He walked back to the desk, opened the drawer again, and stared at the ring. It glittered against the dark wood. Not a symbol of devotion anymore. Just a souvenir. A relic from a moment that almost meant something. But didn't. Not to him. Claire hadn't intended to see him again. After the hotel, after walking away, she had imagined that would be the last chapter. Quiet. Unfinished. But final. Yet, life, with its strange loops, had other plans. She had borrowed a teaching manual from Julian weeks ago. Back when they still spoke like friends. Back when the idea of crossing a line felt distant and hypothetical. The manual wasn't anything important now, but she had promised to return it. And Claire was not the kind of woman who broke promises, even when every cell in her body wished she could. She arrived at the office building just after lunch. The hallways empty, the hum of photocopiers the only sound. Julian's new workspace was on the 4th floor, a corner desk with too much light and too little warmth. She walked down the corridor slowly, the manual tucked under her arm, her coat still damp from the drizzle outside. When she turned the corner and saw his desk, her breath caught in her throat. There it was, her wedding ring, resting casually on a stack of client files. As if it belonged there. As if it were nothing more than a misplaced paperweight. She stopped mid-step, eyes locked on the gleam of gold that had once meant forever. The same ring she had placed into his palm the night before. Trembling, the same ring that had carried her guilt, her restraint, her last shred of identity. Now it sat there like a dare. Julian looked up from his laptop, unsurprised. He smiled. You left it with the wrong person. His voice was smooth, easy, too easy. Claire didn't speak. Her throat had closed around words she didn't want to give him. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms, studying her like she was an article he'd already read twice. I thought you might come by, he said. She stepped forward slowly, picked up the ring, and let it sit in her palm again. It felt different now, not like a symbol, more like evidence of something she had survived. Why did you keep it out? She asked, her voice steady. He shrugged. So you'd see it. She nodded once, more to herself than to him. There were no accusations, no dramatic revelations, just a quiet rupture, the moment when a person realizes the version of someone they were protecting was never real to begin with. Claire looked at him one last time. The way his mouth curled into a smile that wasn't quite regret. The way his eyes dared her to be angry. She wasn't, she was just done. She turned to leave. He called out after her. Claire. She paused but didn't turn. He said, "You know, if you had stayed." She cut him off, voice low but piercing. "If I had stayed, I would have been the one who regretted it." And then she left. In the elevator, she opened her hand and looked at the ring again. She slipped it back onto her finger. Not because she forgave Evan, not because she still believed in the vow, but because it belonged to no one else. And sometimes, the only way to reclaim what was broken is to carry it until it stops hurting. By the time she reached the street, the rain had stopped, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she owed anyone an explanation, especially not the man who thought betrayal only counted if it ended in a kiss. Because Claire knew something deeper now. The one who walked away wasn't the one who betrayed. The one who stayed behind was always planning to cross the line, with or without her permission. The apartment was quiet when Claire returned. Evan wasn't home, likely working late again or pretending to. The hallway light was still on, casting a warm, amber glow across the floor like a welcome she no longer believed in. She stepped out of her shoes, hung her coat without looking, and walked directly to the kitchen where she poured herself a glass of water she didn't want. Just to do something with her hands. She sat down at the dining table, the same place where she and Evan had once played cards on Friday nights. Shared Chinese takeout, made plans that never quite became memories. The ring on her finger felt heavier now, not in its weight, but in the echo of what it had been through. Claire turned it slowly, staring at its surface. It still caught the light in the same way, still shone in the places where her fingers had worn it down over the years. But it no longer symbolized a shared life. It was no longer a contract, a comfort, or a promise. It was a reminder. She hadn't told Evan what had happened. Not about the hotel, not about Julian, not about the ring that sat like bait on another man's desk. Because what hurt the most wasn't the almost affair. It was what the almost had revealed. She whispered to the quiet room, more to herself than to anyone else, "Some people don't need you to cheat to betray you. They just need you to hesitate, so they can do it first." That was what Julian had done. He had watched her falter and used her silence as a gateway. He had planned his betrayal not as a reaction, but as a strategy, and she had almost become part of it. Almost. She took another sip of water and looked around the room, at the life she had built brick by brick. Day by day, with a man who had stopped showing up emotionally years before either of them realized. There was no villain here, no grand affair, just erosion, and a moment where someone else noticed the cracks before she could seal them. Claire stood and walked to the window. The sky was bruising toward night. That strange lavender hour between sunlight and surrender. She held the ring up to the glass and studied its reflection. She hadn't put it back on to fix her marriage. She had put it back on to remember herself. To mark the edge where she almost lost who she was. It didn't mean she was staying. It didn't mean she was leaving. It meant she was listening. To her instincts. To the voice that had whispered to her outside room 704. To the ache that told her something had been wrong for far too long. That night, she didn't cry, she didn't draft an email or a confrontation. She simply placed the ring back in the small velvet box it had come in years ago, and slid it into the drawer of her bedside table. Then she lay down and slept. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time, she no longer felt like she was betraying herself by staying. And that was a beginning. Not a perfect one, but hers. The next morning, she woke to sunlight pooling through the curtains. She got dressed, fed the cats, made coffee, and when Evan walked through the door later that day, tired and distracted, she looked at him, not with anger, not with hope, but with quiet resolve. She would speak soon, not yet, but soon, because now she knew how to listen. And next time, she would hear herself before it was too late. Not everyone regrets almost cheating. Some are just waiting for your silence to become their excuse. And sometimes, the person who didn't cross the line, still ends up the one most betrayed.